Some people said the racers were crazy. I call them fearless. Imagine racing around at speeds of up to 125 miles an hour on banked oval tracks made of 2x4s. They only had goggles and a leather cap to protect them, just a handbrake to slow them down. So when things went wrong, the driver could find himself faced with death. They had these skinny, high-pressure tires. Sometimes they just blew out from hitting holes in the track, caused by rotted wood or from termites eating the wood. When that happened, the car would go into a whipsaw of spins, and the driver had to try and guide it to the infield in the center of the track. If they couldn't do that, the car would smash right through the outer railing and fall many feet to the ground. One time, I heard this news fella call it dancing with the devil.
And it all began in sunny California. It was a fluke that Playa del Rey became the birthplace of board track racing in 1910. The track owed its inception mainly to an immigrant named Jack Prince, a British cyclist who was a pioneer in building velodromes, which were usually very short, wooden tracks used for bicycle racing. A diminutive, impeccably dressed man never without his trademark black derby, Jack was said to be able to sell ice to Eskimos and disappear faster than Houdini. Despite his opportunistic ways, Jack Prince was extremely popular. It was said the worst thing his enemies could say of him was he was a nice conniver.
You know, the real issue for car racers from the very beginning was having a surface to race on. And in Europe, of course, they had, established, metalled roads, paved roads that they could run on. But in the U.S., a lot of the roads were just dirt tracks, and not race tracks, but dirt, paths. In good American expertise, people looked around. And even when the Indianapolis racetrack opened in 1910, the surface, it was kind of an oiled dirt, broke up immediately. And of course, by 1911, they figured out they'd have to put bricks down on the track to keep it together, because the track would break up. That was an expensive option. And Jack Prince, among others, he was a bicycle racer, came up with the idea of using wood, a wooden track, and they built what were called velodromes, which were usually very short, small tracks that bicycle racers could race on.
The Englishman may have pioneered the use of wooden tracks for bicycles, but it took a partner in bicycle racing enthusiast Fred Moscovix, a mechanical engineer from the Armor Institute in Chicago and Polytechnic in Zurich, Switzerland, to conceive the use of wood planking for automobile racing to replace the oiled dirt tracks that were common at the time. Fred's career rivaled the history of the automobile industry itself, working stints at Wilhelm Maybach, Daimler Mercedes, the Allen Kingston Motor Car Company, and Delco Electric, the latter sending him to California where the idea of board tracks sprung. Fred envisioned a track that could hold speeds of up to 100 miles per hour on a banked bowl loosely resembling the velodromes, but wide and strong enough to accommodate large, heavy vehicles. He was so confident in his idea that he purchased property about a half a mile from the ocean in Playa del Rey. Now all he needed was the money. Enter Jack Prince. Prince and Moscovix had met at a cycling race in Springfield, Massachusetts, and ever the consummate salesman, Prince was happy to travel westward and assist in raising funds. Financing secured, construction quickly ensued. Moscovix planned a circular track 45 feet wide banked at an angle of 20 degrees, standing 25 feet off the ground at its perimeter.
I figured a car would hold the line on the banking just like it was being driven straight and wouldn't skid. I was almost right. Most would hold the line, but the really fast ones broke loose right from the start.
To enhance safety, Fred installed dual guardrails around the outer edge and left the inner edge open. The lower rail functioned as a hub rail for the 34 and 36-inch wheels used in this period. The upper rail served as a brace in the event the car turned over. The inner edge of the 45-foot banked area contained a belt of crushed stone to slow vehicles down should a racer leave the wood at a high speed. This was a great idea in theory, but in practice, the vehicle's wheels dug in at a sharp angle and the driver ended up wearing his vehicle like a gigantic top hat.
Jack Prince built a track called Playa del Rey in California. That was the first board track. It was really an oval, like a bike race track. But they raced cars on it, and the surface held up quite well. And what they did was they took basically a 2x4 or 2x6 on edge, and then nailed those boards together, until they got the track.
Track completed, the track promoters needed some star power for the grand opening, and Moscovic successfully got the two best racing rivals of the time to appear, Barney Oldfield and Ralph De Palma. The Playa del Rey track would only last 3 years. A suspicious fire blamed on vagrants destroyed part of the track, and the owners elected not to rebuild it. However, Prince and Moscovic would go on to build 8 more tracks from 1910 through 1916. Playa del Rey was quickly followed by Oakland, California, Chicago, Illinois, Tacoma, Washington, Omaha, Nebraska, Des Moines, Iowa, Cincinnati, Ohio, the last being Uniontown, Pennsylvania in 1916.
The Uniontown Speedway operated from 1916 to 1922. It was a 1.125 oval. The curves were banked at 34 degrees so they could set speed records, which they did. The Duesenberg team set, I think it was 22 speed records that held until the 60s.
Then, just as board track racing became popular across the country, its growth was interrupted in 1917 when President Woodrow Wilson joined World War I to support our allies. Many of the young racers and their managers had been called into service, effectively putting a death nail into the racetrack industry. Billy Taylor, the winner of the last race prior to the war, was shot down over France as he piloted his plane over enemy lines. The end of the war in 1919 kicked off an age of great social and political upheaval known as the Roaring Twenties. An era of mass consumerism was ushered in as the nation's wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929. A cultural civil war began building between city dwellers and small-town residents, between advocates of old-fashioned family values and activists of new, more urban and sometimes racy choices that led to the expansion of some freedoms while others were curtailed. For many people in the United States, the 1920s brought more conflict than celebration. Prohibition, borne by those clinging to conservative values, led to a mass closing of every tavern, bar, and saloon. In response, city dwellers regularly flouted the rules at illegal speakeasies controlled by bootleggers, racketeers, and organized crime figures. Young women with bobbed hair and short skirts known as flappers flouted social mores of the time by drinking, smoking, and saying unladylike things. Their burgeoning influence paving the way for women gaining voting rights. As the number of the nation's radio stations expanded, young America wanted to dance to the new music of the jazz era, while older people objected to the music's supposed depravity. The migration of African Americans from the southern countryside to northern cities and the increasing visibility of black culture discomforted some white Americans, giving rise to the Ku Klux Klan. Amid this backdrop of divisiveness and colossal consumer and social changes arose an unlikely pair of men who would provide the country with a much-needed diversion by kickstarting a new age of racing. Jack Prince would not give up his dream of spreading wooden track across the country to make motorsport racing America's top sport. He just needed a little help. A chance meeting with a brilliant engineer named Art Pillsbury would ignite a second wooden track boom throughout the 20s. The backgrounds and experiences of Art Pillsbury and Jack Prince were as different as black and white. Prince, the English dandy with his squeaky voice, white shoes, derby hat, and mannerisms of Prince Albert. Art Pillsbury, an MIT graduate in civil engineering. Pillsbury was also a compulsive gambler who twice in his early years accumulated $1 million and then lost it. Despite that, his speculative behavior struck again. In 1919, Pillsbury, now a Beverly Hills city engineer, schemed to bring back the glory days of racing by constructing a 1.25-mile oval board track in the city he now called home. To reduce his risk, he needed specifications for a reliable, proven track which he assumed were available from the one man who had built all of the tracks in the country. Allegedly, Pillsbury wired Prince offering him $5,000 for the blueprints to his best track. Prince in turn requested a meeting, at which point he revealed that such blueprints did not exist. All Prince had was a set of measurements for an 1/8-mile bicycle track. Prince advised Pillsbury to simply multiply the measurements by 10 and he would have everything he needed for a 1.25-mile track. As a result of their meeting, Prince and Pillsbury would go on to build 15 speedways: Beverly Hills, Fresno, Cotati, San Carlos, and Culver City, all in California; Kansas City, Missouri; Altoona, located in Tipton, Pennsylvania; Charlotte, located in Pineville, North Carolina; Rockingham, built in Salem, New Hampshire; Laurel, Maryland; Fulford in Miami, Florida; Atlantic City in Amital, New Jersey; Akron, Ohio; Bridgeville, Pennsylvania; and Woodbridge, New Jersey. Although there were 24 board tracks built between 1910 and 1928, none approached the beauty, state-of-the-art design, and notoriety of the Beverly Hills track. Built on 275 acres of land at a cost of $500,000 in the glamour capital of the world, many regarded it as the most opulent speedway ever built in terms of luxury, and the racing surface itself, which many drivers regarded as the greatest ever constructed. The stands were populated by the rich and famous of the burgeoning motion picture industry. The financing to achieve such luxury came in part from motion picture moguls like Cecil B. DeMille and Jesse Lasky and millionaire R.C. Cliff Durant. The investors quickly realized the potential in making movies about this exciting new sport. Hollywood headliners were racing to the track and racing to star in movies about it. Art Pillsbury designed the entire facility, bringing in Jack Prince to build the track. However, Pillsbury designed a triple spiral easement curve into the plans, a type of construction that allowed cars to enter the 48-degree bank turns more smoothly and with less strain on the driver, machine, and tires.
But Prince, he borrowed, there's sort of an argument about this, whether he invented it or borrowed it. I think he borrowed it. From the railroad industry. Was called the spiral easement turn. And that's where the outer rail starts to rise, and it takes the train then, so the train can go around the turn without falling off the tracks. And that spiral easement turn he adapted to his board track, and that was very successful. But it was that spiral easement turn, because once you got up to speed with your car, you literally didn't have to steer it. When the car went into the turn, it didn't just hit the turn and jump up and onto the turn. It moved up onto it, and the car would steer itself, through the turn. Not that you didn't have to keep your eye on it and maintain it, but it would literally drive itself around the turn, and so it put less stress on the driver, although there was plenty of other stuff going on that added stress.
Prior tracks had been built with banked curves with notorious defects, basically half circles at the end of a straightaway. The transition from straight line to a turn made it difficult for drivers to get on and off the curve, and could be very dangerous. It worked well in practice, as racer Joe Boyle christened the new speedway in a blistering practice lap at 110 miles per hour, a world record at the time. Speeds achieved on this newly designed embankment would not be reached again until almost 4 decades later.
The Indianapolis was made out of something like 5 million bricks, and of course it was flat because of it being, a brick track. So the cars were limited in the turns. Indianapolis is also an oval, but the cars would have to decrease their speed in the straightaways to be able to go around the curve safely. But in the board tracks, they didn't have to lower their speed. The banking of the track basically slingshotted them around the turns, so they didn't have to slow down approaching the turn and came out of the turn as fast as they went into it. And that was one of the things that made it so appealing to the public, was the speeds that they drove. Leon Dorier set a track record in Altoona in 1928. He drove 138 miles an hour.
The opening race in February 1920 was an overwhelming success. Some called it the greatest sporting event in the entire Pacific Coast. A who's who of luminaries attended, including the movie stars of the day, Charlie Chaplin, Tom Mix, and Douglas Fairbanks. The Beverly Hills track was operational only between 1920 and 1924, but it launched a decade-long partnership between Pillsbury and Prince that ignited the second of 2 decades of American board track racing. The salesman Prince scouted locations, raised money, and played the role of construction foreman from the West Coast to the East, while Pillsbury tweaked his designs based on the location and terrain. Prince's designs in the early days were mostly seat-of-the-pants expansion of sketches he had of 1880 bicycle racing tracks, but armed with Art Pillsbury's disciplined designs, he would become the builder of every board track in the 1920s longer than half a mile. He may not have been an engineer, but he possibly was an excellent construction foreman, building a typical track from start to finish in weeks. The key to Prince's success was the studiously researched criteria he used to select locations: masses of unskilled labor, a railroad spur adjacent to the track property, and an unlimited supply of lumber. Anyone who could hold a hammer, even children, were employed in the construction of the facility.
They shipped that wood up on a train, stopped right at the track property, and these young boys, so there were no laborers. You know, all the guys were in war, so they had all these high school kids, like 100 high school kids, after school, hammering nails. So they were using horse and buggies and wagons to load the lumber off the trains to build a raceway.
Prince's construction technique was simple. Nearby railroad spurs ensured timely delivery of up to 40,000 feet of lumber per day, enough to keep his construction crew busy. One group completed ground preparation, the second group built vertical posts, the third added track support beams, and the fourth laid the track. Grandstands were added after the track, followed by auxiliary buildings and scoring towers. Finally, the local governments built roads to access the tracks. Once paid, he then turned over the track to the local owners. After that, track management was on its own. Other than actual race sanctioning and organization, which was overseen by the American Automobile Association representatives, the track owners were responsible for publicity, ticket sales, track maintenance, and everything else. Jack Prince never failed to deliver on his promise of an American Automobile Association sanction. Despite Prince's optimistic projections, board tracks did not have a long-term life without continual and expensive maintenance. The race was on to build the faster and faster cars afforded by the new track designs. From Europe came Peugeot, Sunbeam, Mercedes. From America came Packard, Hudson, Stutz, Mercer, Duesenberg, Frontenac, and Miller. Older standard 2-man race cars with 300 cubic inch piston displacement engines from Duesenberg, Frontenac, Ballot, and Peugeot were soon replaced by engines designed by Miller, Duesenberg, and Fiat. As more manufacturers switched to focus the more profitable passenger car industry, they began to drop out, replaced by specialists singularly focused on improving their speed machines. The first major engine design change came in 1924 when Fred and Augie Duesenberg introduced the centrifugal supercharger, earning the nickname Sidewinders because of the blower's position on the side of the car. Within a year, 2 other significant developments occurred. First, balloon tires with wire spokes replaced narrow tires with large wooden spokes, which led to fewer tire changes during the race. The second was Harry Miller's introduction of front-drive racers. Harry Miller and his right-hand man, Leo Goosen, would go on to arguably produce the most beautiful series of race cars the world had ever seen. By 1925, Duesenberg lost focus and, like many others, turned to passenger cars, while Miller and Goosen never lost sight of building racing machines. Their cars won more races than any other designer. Interestingly, the subject of team cars, team drivers, team strategy, and team sponsorship were much different than today. Race car teams meant nothing more than a car fielded by the same entrant and under control or sponsorship of one party. The Duesenbergs often entered and ran team cars, while Henry Miller sold his cars to wealthy individual drivers.
Well, some of the owners were factory-sponsored teams. Other owners were simply wealthy people that liked racing and had the income that they could buy a race car. Harry Miller was famous for producing race cars and selling them to anybody that wanted to buy one. And if you had the income to buy one of those cars that could compete at that level, you were financially well off. It would be like buying an Indy car and team today. Who could afford it but some very wealthy people.